Thanks, Ravi. And it's good to see you as well, and all of you, but specifically Ravi, because I remember we are now working 2 years probably in VETS on the board. We haven't seen each other except from behind the screen. And when we just were chatting, we both were saying, well, you look tall. Yeah, I think you look tall as well. So, but we know everything about our backgrounds in our houses and offices. So good to see you as well, Ravi. Good to see you all. Indeed, my name is Ramon Ernst from Evos. And I'm the managing director at Evos Amsterdam. And I'm also responsible for the sustainability program we have running across the group. I have a presentation, but actually I only have one slide, which is a bit new for the people that know me, and I see some familiar faces. That's strange for me, because usually I bring a pack of slides. I could have a consultancy background, so I'm used to it. But I have only one slide. That is this one, plus an animation. So I'm going to do it a bit different, because I thought you're going to see probably a lot of slides already during these days. And I want to bring the conversation more forward, instead of just delivering a message to you. So I also have a mic here. I might actually go around a little bit and ask you some questions here and there. You can ask me questions. So let's kick off. And what I want to do in this talk is to reflect on the latest developments that are happening sort of in the geopolitical field around us, because they impact what we do today. And then I'm going to talk what we are doing as Evos to address these challenges, because I think it all links together. And then I will show a concrete project that we are working on in Amsterdam that aims at importing a lot of hydrogen that we're going to need given those developments. So, looking at the latest geopolitical developments, I think there are at least two things that we need to learn from that. First of all, is that the energy system that we have today, as it is very fragile. And we see that. We see that relatively, the remote developments can play an impact here today. We talk now about an energy crisis. I think Lucia also this morning or this afternoon talked about it. We're not that far away that we have shortages, for example, of diesel. So this is, I think, a new understanding that I think is broadly shared now also with policymakers, that the system that we have today first of all, needs to be maintained. It's very lean, but it's also very fragile. And there are a lot of interdependencies in that system. And storage plays an essential part in that, because we ensure that those imbalances in the world are sort of managed in a good way, and we provide the buffer storage that is needed to bring all those supply chains into work. So that's I think one lesson we can learn from it. The second lesson we can learn from it is that we need to accelerate the energy transition, as we call it. There's a clear understanding now that we need to switch to more renewable forms of energy. The sooner the better. Not only because of climate change, but also to reduce, let's say, international dependencies that we don't want to have. Also for that, in that development, also their storage is crucial. Because we ensure that we deliver the right forms of energy to the end user. So also there, I think storage is vital, not only as a buffer, but also making sure that we provide the logistics facilities to move forward the energy from source to destination. So, and both developments show that storage is more important than ever. And we at Evos, we take that responsibility very seriously. We look at what we have today, and we need to ensure that we keep the system running as it is. But we're also investing heavily in the energy system of the future. Maybe a bit more about Evos, because we're still a relatively new storage company. We started in 2019 as a spin-off from Vopak. First, we acquired the terminals from Vopak in Amsterdam and Hamburg, and then we added a terminal in Algeciras. We started with a few colleagues. One of them is there, Jos Steeman still, one of the founding members as well of the sort of initial gang. And then after that, we rapidly continued to expand. We acquired a terminal in Rotterdam here from Caldic, and a half a year ago, we acquired 4 terminals from oil tanking. So we have now a group of 8 terminals in Europe, that's rapidly growing, and we have a nice presence here across the continent. And we are not done yet. We are continuing to look at investment opportunities because we want to build a very strong terminal portfolio here in this part of the world. What's important also to understand about Evos is, and what I think helps us also in this discussion, is that we have a very long-term perspective. Also, the investors in our company have a very long-term approach. Not a short-term, but it's really a long-term focus. And that helps us also to understand how these long-term trends play out and what the impact on our company will be, and what solutions we can provide. That helps. So what we are doing both. We do two things. We invest in maintaining the current energy system. We have a role in there to play, if we like it or not. And this is a role that carries a lot of responsibility, especially in today's world. There's a lot of opinions about the traditional energy system, let's call it fossil fuels. There's a lot of push also to phase it out. But still today, and probably tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, we're still heavily relying on that. And you saw that also in the presentations of previous speakers. So we're going to maintain that energy system. But at the same time, we also follow a path to the future. And we look there at three key things in our opinion. First is that we're going to look at solutions that also fit the infrastructure that we have today. So we're looking at synergies between what we have on the ground already as an installed base and how we can use that in the future. And secondly, we are technology neutral. And that's also important. We're going to talk about hydrogen in a second. But still, there's a lot of development still going on even in that field, if you look at the different carrier technologies. And we don't know yet what technology will prevail in the end. And if you look close at it, you will see that there's probably merit in all of those. And there should be a combination of those. And I will explain a little bit more about that shortly. And thirdly, we look at applications where we see the most demand. So you can also approach this from a push perspective, but we're really looking at pull factors, long-term pull factors. So we're doing intensive analysis to see what are the sectors in the future that will be in need mostly of, let's say, the new energy system of the future. And what are the products they're going to use and what kind of supply requirements they have. So that's for us also important. If we look specifically at fuels, because that is still a large part of our business, also in Amsterdam, and the two terminals we have there is largely built on fuels, distribution fuels. There we distinguish three phases, and we work on all of these. The first phase is still the phase where we're in today, and that is ensuring that there are sufficient clean petroleum products available for the end user. And clean sounds maybe like a bit of a strange term in this respect, but for us is that fuels that contain low sulfur and low benzene. And you see a trend in the world that we more and more demand those kind of fuels. And that, we look for that for domestic, but also for export markets. The second is biofuels. And I think we have also talked about that before in other presentations we saw as well, as about FAME and HVO. And there we also look at not only those, but also ethanol as a drop-in fuel. And that's, as we saw, a lot of driven by the European Union RED II directive. And then the third phase, what we're going to see in 5 to 10 years, scaling up, is synfuels and hydrogen. Either based on biogas-based or, of course, hydrogen-based. And hydrogen is then, of course, produced by green electricity increasingly. Now, we see the evolution between those three phases as a natural evolution. You see that already with drop-in fuels. You see that how biofuels are mixed with traditional fuels, so it all links to each other. And the question is a lot about timing. So the investments that we are making, ensuring both that we still cater for those three phases. But of course, increasingly, we're going to allocate funds to the second and third phase. So again, for us, it's very important to see where we can find synergies between those different fuel types, but also how we can make use of our infrastructure in the best possible way. Now, one example of what we are working on is the hydrogen import project, so-called H2A project that we have in Amsterdam. And yeah, let me show you a small animation and then explain a little bit more about it. Should I push the button myself or can you do that?
Europe is on the road towards a fossil-free society. Sustainable, reliable and affordable energy and raw materials for industry and transport can be realized using green hydrogen. With the announcement of Fit for 55, the importance of an accelerated development of a green hydrogen market is underscored once more. Green hydrogen can be produced with electrolysis of water using electricity from solar and wind. This electricity is used to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. In the Netherlands, green electricity from solar and wind does not suffice to make all sectors sustainable. Even with future planned solar and wind parks, we cannot meet growing demand. That is why we're going to import hydrogen from areas where sufficient and affordable green electricity is being produced. The H2A consortium aims to import 1 million tons of hydrogen per year via the Port of Amsterdam. To safely transport hydrogen, it can be charged onto a hydrogen carrier. With these hydrogen carriers, transport and storage are safe, flexible and cost competitive. By making transport sustainable, sharing infrastructure, energy exchange, using new technologies and jointly offering green hydrogen to end users, we can guarantee a 100% green value chain. This is unique. Amsterdam is also the place to be for trade and transshipment of hydrogen towards other parts of northwestern Europe. In this way, our impact is not limited to vital industries and transport in the Port of Amsterdam and the Netherlands, such as steelmaking, aviation and inland shipping, but also helps to reach a 100% green value chain in other areas in Europe to contribute to a carbon-neutral society. We are ready to take the lead towards a zero-net future. Let's get going.
No, not again. Okay. Yeah, that's the H2A initiative. And there are a couple of highlights, I think, that are important to consider. First is we focus on import of hydrogen. Of course, a lot of initiatives also about producing locally hydrogen. We believe, at the analysis that we showed, that there will be a large need for import as well. From areas where there's abundant sun or wind, we can produce hydrogen there at relatively low cost, and that needs to be then transported here in the most efficient way. And there this project comes into play. The second important thing about this project, and why I believe it stands out from others, is that we aim high. We deliberately set the bar high and aim for 1 million tons of hydrogen per annum. And we do that really to test the boundaries of the proposition, to really think, what are the spatial requirements? What are the energetic requirements? What are the logistic requirements? What are the financial requirements to get that system up and running? Because if you know that, you can plan ahead already and then scale it back to today. And very often we start with relatively low scale pilots, but we deliberately do it from both angles. We start with those pilots, but we also aim for the bigger picture to see how it would fit in. The second or the third thing that is important to realize, and you see the partners here below, we combine several carrier technologies in one project. So we don't look only for a point-to-point solution for one individual carrier. We look at a combination of those. And we do that for a specific reason. First of all, as I've said already before, we don't know exactly in the end, what technology will win most market share. They are still in relatively early stage of development. And you see here that we combine both LOHC with also liquid inorganic hydrogen carrier, so that it's also a liquid carrier of inorganic nature, and also a solid version. There's a potassium borohydrate that we also combine here. And we combine it because if you look closer at those, you will see that each of those technologies will find a best market need. If you look at both the power sectors but also mobility applications, each of those carrier has its merits. And you see already now, and we are now 1.5 years working on this project, that we have a much better understanding of what market segments will probably use which carrier in the future. So therefore, we aim to build an ecosystem where all those carriers fit and eventually will float into the market segments where they have the best fit. And we also combine that because if you set up an ecosystem, you will also discover that there are synergies between them in that ecosystem itself. One clear example is the so-called dehydrogenation step. It's a step where you take off the hydrogen from the carrier. For a couple of those technologies, that process is endothermic, means that it requires energy. But we also have a carrier in the portfolio that's exothermic, so that delivers energy when you take off the hydrogen from the carrier. So by combining those in one release facility, we can basically use the energy that's generated by one to fire and maintain the dehydrogenation process from another carrier. So there you see already clear synergies. Other synergies are in logistics, obviously. We have already a huge installed base of storage tanks in Amsterdam in this case, more than 240 tanks. Of course, we're going to look where we can fit those carriers best in, not only the flow all the way down, but also the return flow. But there will also be a return flow of carriers of which the hydrogen is already separated from, so the so-called exhausted carriers. So we're looking for our facility where we can fit this all in, and we believe we can fit those. And there you can basically get a break bulk operation like we have today for traditional fuels. And not only for the flow, but also for the return flow. Now, that's interesting about this project. We see that there will be a development of hubs, logistic hubs, where this takes place. Not only for a supply chain function, but also in a trading function. We see now already requests from parties that approach us that would like to trade in carriers. Both in, let's say, loaded and depleted form. So there will be a huge, basically international supply chain and trading system being set up around hydrogen. And for that you need infrastructure. Now, we're going to build that in the port of Amsterdam. In the end, as I said in the beginning, it's all a gradual development from one phase to another. We expect in the future that this will similarly looks in a similar way as we have today the international supply chains for fuels. It will just be different fuels. And there will also be trading taking place. And there will even be blending taking place between different carriers. Now, the question is how we're going to manage that transition. Now, we have committed ourselves to making this journey. We are working with credible partners, but we basically invite you to join us. So if there's any interest from your side, consider Amsterdam. There's a couple of advantages we have there. There's a lot of offshore wind. We have large local off-takers. We have already an infrastructure in place, both for storage, but also in terms of vessel handling. So Amsterdam is a nice place to start to do this. And I'm saying this here in Rotterdam with allowance. So, thank you very much for your attention. If there are any questions, I'm happy to address those. Any questions?
Hello. Fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. For me, we see a very similar projects announced in the UK and across Europe. What is your timeline for this, if you can share that? What's production startup, etc.?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Good question. The timeline is that we aim for this 1 million tons around 2030, 2035. The first step that we're going to take in the next 2 years is already scaling up towards a small-scale pilot of 30 kilotons. And we're going to approach the 100 kilotons in 2025, 2026. And then the scaling is important, because if you scale, every step in the ladder has different challenges. As I said, we approach it from different angles. We start small, but we also look already at the big picture and work back from the big picture towards today. Other questions?
Yeah, thank you. An interesting presentation indeed. Just curious, you focus only on hydrogen carriers, not ammonia or the gasified hydrogen or anything. What's your rationale behind that?
Good question, yeah. Ammonia is in the picture, but not for this project. And that has to do with the fact that it's an efficient carrier, but it also has some characteristics that need to be managed properly. And one, of course, is that it's very toxic. And in Amsterdam, to enter the port, you need to pass a lock and you come quite close to residential areas. So we think on the permitting side, it will be quite challenging. But there are other locations in the Evos portfolio where indeed we work on ammonia. And it comes back to the initial point that I was making. There's merit in all of those carriers. There will not be one prevailing, is my prediction. It depends on the specific circumstances. And as I just explained for Amsterdam, ammonia is not an option. But it might be here for Rotterdam, if it's a bit offshore, or in other locations where you have less of those constraints. But for us, in this project, we're going to look at intrinsically safe carriers that can be transported to relatively densely populated areas.
You're a storage company, but those before the splitting of the hydrogen, that's a process. Are you also getting involved in that, or are other companies taking care of that part?
Yeah, we do it jointly because it all links to each other, and you need to think with those, as I mentioned about the release side, how you can make clever combinations. So we have accumulated quite some knowledge about those processes on the dehydrogenation side, but also on the hydrogenation side. Eventually, I can imagine as a company like Evos, we're not going to fully lead and own such activities. We are a storage company, we're not a chemical process company. But my point now is that you need to accumulate knowledge and set up a value chain together. And it comes down a lot about the efficiency of those processes. And there's still a big learning curve. And it's important for us to be able to understand what are the steps there still to come. And even ammonia, for example, it looks nice, but dehydrogenation, you need to crack it. It takes a lot of energy. It's not easy. So we better understand the full picture. Mark, there you go.
Again, really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you. The answer to my question might be behind an NDA, but are you seeing good things happening on the demand side that is going to support this initiative?
Thanks for the warning, Mark. I see good developments. We see both in the Netherlands, but also in Germany. We are being approached by large potential off-takers, be it in the power sector, but also the steel sector. So there's a clear need, and they have set already, ambitious targets for themselves to convert. And for example, if you look at Germany, we are connected to Germany here greatly, with all the rivers. So you see barges floating every day to Germany and back and forward. So there is already a supply chain there. So we are working there with different large industrial users, but also inland ports to see what we can do there. And here locally, we have, of course, as I mentioned, we have here in Amsterdam, we have, for example, a huge steel giant, which is Tata Steel, which we work closely with, but also the Schiphol Airport. Our terminal has a pipeline connection to Schiphol. So we are the provider of jet fuel for the planes that you probably used also to come here. And of course, there is, as we saw earlier, there is a mandate in the end to get the renewable share up there. So, and that will then be delivered also via our storage tanks and via the pipeline. So both here in Amsterdam, but also the broader region, there's definitely appetite for these solutions. More questions? One more? Erik. Yeah, you raised your thumb.
I was just hoping that you could confirm what's the water source within the supply chain. Is it fresh water or is it seawater?
Good question. On different stages. Of course, in the initial stage, but also, let me focus on the dehydrogenation step. Because there are also two carriers in the portfolio that require water. And if you add water to it, then the hydrogen is released. It needs to be sweet water, but it doesn't have to be purified. That's the short answer. So that is, you need to eliminate the salt from it. And of course it can have some imperfections in it, but that will mean that you will basically, the sludge that you then get in the end will be a bit more challenging to process. Just the purer the water is, the easier the remaining carrier, what's left over, the easier it is to handle and to resell.
Sorry, I just have a follow-up question. So water is becoming an equally contested resource, and so is there a great opportunity cost to this sweet water, and therefore do we need to build anti-fragility into this supply chain and transition to seawater in future so that it doesn't become like drinking water?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. The water is an interesting thing, and just 2 weeks ago I was in another talk that I held with Lucia. We also talked about that. In the end, maybe we're going to use our storage tanks for water as well, because water is going to be a scarce resource. That's quite clear. You will see that all around us. So for this process, that's definitely a cost that we need to factor in, and that's quite clear. And this is not by no means cheap yet. Nobody has asked me about the cost yet, so it's good, because I was not planning to give those figures. But we're still multiples away from where we need to be. Still. Yeah, a question. I like those questions, good.
Okay, yeah. I'm Rit van Stralen. I would like to ask you, are you also considering to build gas storage facilities in Amsterdam as part of the project? And if yes, how big?
Yeah, we're going to... of course, we are focusing on carriers, so not on pure hydrogen. But of course, eventually, we need to build some storage facilities for the hydrogen, of course, that's emitted in the process. Those will be relatively small-scale units. Because again, it is costly, but it's also, in terms of permitting, all the zoning around this is quite challenging. So we are working with carriers here to avoid large-scale storage of gaseous hydrogen, obviously. But after the release plant, you will need a small-scale storage, basically to buffer your hydrogen before you release it into the grid or into a further distribution. So that's part of the scope. Okay. Then I say thank you all for listening and also for the questions. It was indeed a dialogue that I intended. So thanks very much. Thank you.